For years, we've been told that the struggle with lust is something hidden in the shadows, something people don't talk about, especially those who are chosen, the ones who seem perfect, the ones closest to God. But here's the dark truth: they struggle with it too. You may think that devout individuals, the ones who spend their lives in prayer and service, are immune to this temptation. But that's a lie. The reality is far more painful. They hide it from you. Every day they carry the weight of their secret struggle, and it's eating away at their souls. Lust doesn't care if you're chosen. It doesn't care if you're a priest, a pastor, or a devout believer. It's a relentless force that claws at your heart, at your mind, at your very spirit, and if left unchecked, it leads to devastating consequences: spiritual destruction. What happens when you're supposed to be living a life devoted to God, but this temptation gnaws at you in the dark? What happens when you know what's right but can't stop the pull of something you know will tear you apart? For many, the answer is to hide it. Pretend it doesn't exist. They put on a mask, play the part, but inside, they're crumbling. But there's a way out. There is hope. In the depths of despair, the answer lies in facing this battle head-on. The solution isn't hiding. It's confronting the sin, acknowledging it, and replacing it with the light of God. Overcoming lust isn't easy, but it is possible. In this video, we will uncover how those who are chosen can fight and overcome the temptation that has tormented them for so long. We will explore the steps they take to transform their lives and find peace. Now, I want you to think about your own struggles. Have you ever faced a temptation that made you feel like you're losing the battle? What did you do to overcome it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because you're not alone in this. Noah was a man of faith. He lived in a small village where everyone knew him as the pillar of integrity, a true man of God. His days were spent serving others, guiding those who sought wisdom, and upholding the teachings of Christ. People came to him for advice, for prayer, believing he was a living example of holiness. But behind closed doors, in the silence of his own heart, a dark secret consumed him. It started innocently enough. At first, he thought it was just a fleeting thought, a brief distraction, a temptation that would pass. But it didn't. It lingered, quietly whispering in the back of his mind. He would push it away, telling himself it was nothing more than a fleeting desire, something that had no real power over him. But the more he ignored it, the more it grew. And then, one day, it overtook him. Noah's struggle was not one that anyone could see. To the outside world, he was a model of righteousness. His prayers were sincere, his actions were selfless. But deep within, the battle raged on. He couldn't escape the pull of temptation. He tried to distract himself with work, with prayer, but it followed him, a constant presence lurking in the shadows. The guilt began to gnaw at him. He felt it every time he knelt to pray, every time he went to the altar. His mind wandered, no longer focused on God, but consumed by the sin he thought he could control. It was an endless cycle. The temptation would rise, he would fight it, but it would always return stronger. Every time, it was harder to resist. In his heart, Noah believed that the temptation was something he could defeat. After all, he had overcome so many other trials in his life. He had walked through the storm of grief, the trial of loss, and the darkness of doubt. But this was different. It was more insidious, more relentless. It didn't just pull at his willpower, it eroded his very sense of self. He began to question whether he was truly as strong in his faith as he had always believed. The more he struggled, the more isolated he became. He couldn't speak to anyone about what he was experiencing. Who would understand? Who could he turn to when the very thing he was battling was something so deeply ingrained in the human condition? It wasn't something people openly discussed. It was too shameful, too painful. To admit it would be to expose the very darkness he was trying to keep hidden. And so, he remained silent, silently suffering in the depths of his soul. But the darkness didn't stop. It began to take over his every thought. Noah began to feel like he was living two lives, One was the outwardly righteous Noah that everyone knew, the Noah who preached purity, kindness, and devotion. But the other was a man haunted by desires he could not control, a man burdened with shame that he could never escape. As his battle continued, Noah's inner turmoil deepened. Every time he gave in, even just for a moment, he felt like he was slipping further away from God. His prayers felt empty, his faith hollow. How could he stand before his community, offering them counsel, when he himself was broken? How could he help others overcome their trials when he was consumed by his own? Noah's heart grew heavy with guilt. He saw the darkness not only as something that haunted him, but as a force that would eventually pull him away from God. He began to fear that his secret would eventually destroy everything: his ministry, his relationships, his connection with God. He could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. Every time the temptation overcame him, it was as though he was taking one more step into the abyss. He could feel the weight of his sin dragging him down, suffocating him. The fear of losing his salvation, of being cut off from the grace of God, became an ever-present terror. He saw in his mind's eye the image of a soul wandering, lost and abandoned, unable to find its way back to the light. The consequences weren't just physical, they were spiritual, eternal, and he knew it. Noah realized that the longer he hid from the truth, the deeper the wound would grow. The longer he allowed the temptation to control him, the harder it would be to escape. He began to understand that his battle wasn't just a matter of willpower or self-control, it was a matter of surrendering himself to God's will. He couldn't overcome this on his own. The weight of sin was too much for him to bear alone. Yet, there was still hope. Noah knew that God's grace was greater than any sin, greater than any temptation. But the fear of what he had already done lingered in his heart. Could God forgive him? Could he still be used for God's work after everything he had allowed himself to do in secret? Each time he tried to pray, the weight of his sin seemed to block his connection with God. His prayers felt like words without meaning. He felt lost. His mind raced, consumed with thoughts of damnation. He had heard stories of others who had fallen, their lives torn apart by their inability to conquer the darkness within, and deep down, Noah feared that he too was destined to be another example of someone who could not rise above their own sins. It was a terrifying thought, the possibility of never escaping this trap. But in the silence of his prayer, Noah felt something stirring deep within his soul. He couldn't explain it, but he felt the presence of God, a gentle whisper calling him to return, to seek redemption. It wasn't too late, but the journey ahead would not be easy. The consequences of his hidden struggle had already begun to affect him, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But Noah now stood at a crossroads. Would he continue to live in secret, hiding behind his facade of righteousness, or would he face the darkness head-on and seek the healing he so desperately needed? He knew the answer was clear, but the path forward would demand everything he had. He would have to confront his fears, his guilt, and the shame that had bound him for so long. Only then could he hope to break free. But the question lingered. In his mind, would he be strong enough to face it? Would he be able to overcome this struggle once and for all? Noah sat alone in his dimly lit room, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. The whispers that had once been faint, barely noticeable, now echoed in his mind with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the very walls were closing in, trapping him in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. For weeks he had tried to push the temptation away, telling himself that he was stronger than this, that he could control it. But deep down, he knew something was changing. He could feel the pull of sin growing stronger, the attraction undeniable. It had taken root in his heart, and now it was taking over his mind. "I can control it," Noah reassured himself, pacing back and forth, trying to convince himself that he was still in control. "I am strong enough. I am a man of God. This is just a fleeting moment of weakness." His words echoed in the silence of the room, but they felt hollow, empty. He had said them so many times before, but this time they didn't carry the same weight. This time, they felt more like a lie. The guilt had been weighing on him for days, maybe even weeks. But tonight was different. Tonight it felt unbearable. Every time he closed his eyes, the images and thoughts that haunted him seemed to be getting stronger. He could almost taste the forbidden pleasure, a sensation that both repelled and enticed him. And yet, he told himself it wasn't a big deal. No one will know, he rationalized. I can keep it hidden. It won't affect my faith. I'm still doing good works, still helping people. But deep down, Noah knew that this wasn't just a passing moment of temptation. This was something far more dangerous, something that could pull him away from everything he had worked for. The lie he had told himself, the one that had begun so innocently, was now becoming harder to ignore. He had convinced himself that his desires were justified. After all, he was only human, right? Everyone has weaknesses. It wasn't as if he was hurting anyone. He wasn't breaking any commandments, at least not in a way that was visible to the world. His reputation remained intact, and that was what mattered, wasn't it? But the more Noah tried to convince himself, the more he realized the truth. This was no longer just a struggle. This was a trap. Each passing day, his thoughts began to slip further into the darkness. What started as a single fleeting thought had now evolved into something far more dangerous, something that began to shape his actions. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, Noah found himself alone in his room, staring at the walls, unable to shake the growing pull of sin. He told himself that he could stop whenever he wanted. He was in control. He had to be. But the darkness whispered louder, urging him to give in, to surrender to the desires that now consumed him. No one will ever know, the voice promised. It's just you, alone, in this moment. You're not hurting anyone. And for a brief second, Noah believed it. He believed that maybe, just maybe, he could indulge in this secret and walk away unscathed. But deep down, Noah knew that sin, when fed, never stays hidden for long. It always grows. It always spreads. The first time Noah allowed himself to fall deeper into sin, he felt the weight of it, the shame, the guilt, the momentary pleasure that left him feeling emptier than before. It didn't satisfy him. It never did. But still, the next time, it was easier. And the next time, even easier still. Each time, it became harder to fight, harder to resist. And soon, Noah realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't in control anymore. Now he was not just battling a temptation, he was feeding it, nurturing it, allowing it to grow inside of him. The longer he justified his actions, the stronger the sin became. What started as an innocent indulgence, a small act that he could convince himself wasn't a big deal, had transformed into a constant battle, a war within his soul. Noah could no longer deny the truth that had always been there. Sin, when indulged, takes over everything. The consequences were not just spiritual, they were psychological, emotional, and relational. Noah began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior. He was more irritable, more withdrawn. His thoughts were constantly clouded, and he felt more distant from God with each passing day. Prayer no longer felt like a conversation with a loving Father. It felt like an obligation, a performance he put on to appease his guilt. His connection with others began to fade, and he found himself avoiding his friends, his family, anyone who might see through the mask he had carefully constructed. Noah's heart was heavy with shame. He knew he had fallen, and yet he couldn't seem to stop. Each time he gave in, the chain around his soul grew tighter. He began to fear that there would be no escape. What if this was his fate? What if he could never break free? The fear of losing everything, the trust of his community, his relationship with God, his own sense of self-worth, haunted him day and night. But it wasn't just the fear of others, finding out that kept Noah awake at night. It was the fear of the consequences of his sin. The true consequences were spiritual. He feared the day when God might turn his back on him, when his secret would no longer be hidden, and he would have to face the destruction he had wrought in his own heart. What would God say to him when he finally stood before him, burdened with the weight of his sin? And so, Noah continued to fight this battle in secret, trapped in a cycle of sin, shame, and self-deception. He told himself that he could control it, that he could repent when the time came, but deep down he knew that sin never stays small. It always grows. It always takes more. And every time Noah justified his actions, it felt like a small piece of his soul was being sold. Does this sound familiar? Have you ever convinced yourself that you were in control, only to realize that the very thing you thought you could handle was now handling you? The lie that sin tells us is that it's harmless, that it won't affect anyone else, that it's just a momentary pleasure. But the truth is far darker. Sin, once indulged, takes root in your heart, and if left unchecked, it will consume everything. But there is hope. You don't have to fall victim to this deception. It's never too late to fight back, to confront the lies you've been telling yourself, and to reclaim your purity. But it starts with the truth. You have to be honest with yourself about the danger, the consequences, and the fact that you can't fight this alone. It's only through God's strength, His mercy, and His grace that you can break free. Now think about this for a moment. Have you ever found yourself justifying a desire or a temptation, convincing yourself that it wasn't really that bad? What was the outcome of that? How did it affect your life? Write your thoughts below because you're not alone in this fight. The truth is, we're all in this together. The weight of Noah's secret grew heavier with each passing day, and though the world around him remained blissfully unaware, he could feel the cracks in his spirit deepening. His prayers, once a source of solace and connection to God, now felt hollow. He would kneel beside his bed, offering up words that no longer carried the weight they once had. His heart, instead of being filled with peace, felt heavy with guilt and shame, as though he were speaking to a distant God, one who no longer seemed to be listening. The intimacy he once shared with the Creator was slipping through his fingers like sand, and with every attempt to call out, the silence was deafening. His faith, once solid and unwavering, began to tremble. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion, a slow chipping away at the foundation of his beliefs. He found himself questioning the very truths he had once held dear. Was God still with him? Could God still love him despite what he had done? Each day, the answer seemed less clear, and the temptation to ignore it all, to continue down the path of secrecy, began to feel more tempting than ever. But the consequences of his hidden indulgence were becoming impossible to ignore. They seeped into every part of his life, creeping into his thoughts, his actions, and even his relationships. Noah had always been a man of community. He had friends, family, and people who relied on him for guidance and support. Yet slowly but surely, he began to withdraw. At first, it was subtle. He'd skip a gathering here and there, make excuses, not to meet with friends, or turn down invitations to church, but over time, the distance grew. His loved ones began to notice the change. They could see it in his eyes, in his silence, in the way he avoided meaningful conversations. Noah was there physically, but he wasn't truly present. It wasn't just that his relationships with others were suffering. It was also his relationship with himself. Every moment alone was now filled with self-loathing, with the haunting thought that he could never be truly free. He had hoped that his secret indulgence wouldn't affect his relationships, that it wouldn't make him a stranger to those who cared about him. But the truth was undeniable. He was losing the ability to connect with the people he loved, and worse, he was losing touch with the man he had once been. He could no longer remember the last time he had felt pure or at peace. Noah's attempts to break free from his hidden sin were growing more desperate by the day. He prayed, he fasted, he tried to distract himself with work, but the temptation was always there, lingering in the back of his mind. It was as if his secret sin had taken root deep within his soul, and the more he tried to fight it, the stronger it became. The guilt was suffocating, and the shame was unbearable. But instead of feeling closer to God with each attempt at repentance, Noah felt more isolated than ever before. He was trapped in a cycle he couldn't break, and with every failed attempt to escape, he found himself sinking deeper into despair. One evening, as Noah sat in his quiet room, He finally faced the terrifying reality of his situation. His secret was no longer something he could hide from. The cost of his indulgence had far exceeded what he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the momentary pleasure he had sought. It was about everything he had lost in the process. The peace of mind, the clarity of spirit, and the connection to God that had once defined his life. His sin had stolen so much more than he had ever realized. The consequences were spiritual, yes, but they were also deeply personal. The deeper Noah sank into his secret struggle, the more he could feel the very essence of his being slipping away. His identity was being rewritten by the lies he had told himself, and his relationship with God, once the bedrock of his life, was now a shadow of what it had been. He could no longer hear God's voice as clearly as he once had, and the spiritual fire that had once burned brightly within him now flickered weakly, barely enough to light his way. As he looked at himself in the mirror, Noah couldn't recognize the man staring back. His face, once filled with purpose and hope, now seemed tired, worn down by the weight of his secret. His eyes were dull, lacking the light they had once held. He was not the same man who had once walked confidently in the light of God's grace. He had allowed the darkness to take root in his soul, and now it was all-consuming. The truth began to settle in. Sin always demands a price, and that price was far higher than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the moment of indulgence, it was about everything that came after: the spiritual decay, the broken relationships, the loss of peace, and the growing distance between him and the God he once served. The temptation that had once seemed so small, so insignificant, had now become a ravenous beast, devouring everything in its path. Noah knew deep down that he couldn't keep living this way. The weight of his hidden sin was far too great to bear. His soul was at war, and he was losing. He could feel himself being pulled further away from the light, deeper into the darkness of shame and regret. Every attempt to escape only led him further into the grip of the enemy. But as the darkness threatened to consume him, Noah realized that there was still hope. He had to confront the truth of what he had done. He had to face the consequences of his actions and bring his secret into the light, no matter how painful it might be. He knew that the road to redemption would not be easy, but he also knew that without facing the truth, he would be lost forever. And so, with a trembling heart, Noah began to make the hardest decision of his life. He would confess his sin. He would face the shame, the guilt, and the fear, and he would seek the forgiveness that only God could offer. He didn't know what the consequences would be. He didn't know if his relationships could be repaired, or if he could ever truly reclaim the peace he had lost. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't keep living in the darkness. The cost of his hidden sin had been far too great, and the only way forward was through the light of confession, repentance, and the mercy of God. The consequences had unfolded in ways Noah could never have predicted, but he was determined to find the strength to make things right, to reclaim his faith, and to rebuild what had been broken. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The price of his hidden sin had been steep, but the price of redemption, he knew, was worth any cost. The weight of Noah's guilt had reached a suffocating point. Each night when he laid down to sleep, he could feel the crushing pressure of his actions bearing down on him, and the silence of the night only amplified the haunting voices in his mind. The shame had become a constant companion, following him everywhere he went. He couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried, it lingered like a dark cloud, always overhead. It felt as though his soul was unraveling, slowly but surely, with each passing day. His prayers had become mechanical, almost desperate, but they lacked the fervor they once had. He had no words left to express the pain inside, no petitions to make anymore. His faith, once so sure and firm, had eroded, replaced with doubt and despair. It was a battle he couldn't win on his own, and he knew it. He was sinking deeper and deeper, and it seemed as though there was no way out. One night, as the guilt began to overwhelm him once again, Noah found himself standing at the edge of an emotional precipice. He felt like he was drowning, unable to breathe, the weight of his secret sins pulling him further into the abyss. It was in this moment, on the edge of hopelessness, that he stumbled across a book that had once belonged to his grandfather, a book filled with spiritual wisdom and guidance. It had been gathering dust on the shelf for years, but that night, it felt like an answer to a prayer he hadn't even dared to speak aloud. He opened the book, flipping through the pages with trembling hands, and his eyes landed on a particular passage that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a quote from Padre Pio, the holy priest known for his deep spirituality and unwavering faith. The words seemed to leap off the page and grab hold of his heart. Temptations against purity must be fought with strong determination. Do not argue with them. Despise them. Noah read the words again, his heart racing as the full weight of the message sank in. Despise them, Padre Pio had said. Those words hit him like a hammer to the chest. For so long, Noah had been engaging with his temptation, rationalizing it, even justifying it. He thought he could control it, that he could manage his desires, keep them hidden and compartmentalized. But in that moment, he realized just how wrong he had been. The temptation he had fought against for so long wasn't something to be coddled or entertained. It wasn't something to be rationalized or justified. It was an enemy to be fought, despised, and cast aside, once and for all. The very core of his struggle, the lies he had believed about himself and his sin, came crashing down around him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Noah saw the truth with clarity. His weakness was not his sin itself, but the way he had allowed it to take root in his soul. He had been too complacent, too passive in his fight against it. Noah's heart began to pound as he continued to reflect on the words of Padre Pio. They weren't just a spiritual lesson, they were a command, a direct and powerful call to action. He could no longer remain in this passive state of guilt and shame. He had to act. The temptation would not go away on its own. It would only grow stronger if he allowed it to continue to occupy space in his life. Strong determination, he repeated to himself. What did that mean for him? What would it look like for Noah to truly fight back? He could no longer afford to make excuses or try to reason with his desires. It was time to take drastic measures, to stop feeding the temptation with his own self-pity and indulgence. It was time to cut it off at the root. Noah spent the next several hours reflecting on his life, on the things he had allowed to slip by, the ways he had compromised his integrity. His mind raced and the weight of his secret sins felt almost unbearable, but through the fog of shame he felt something else, a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, he felt as though he could see a way out of the darkness. He realized that the way forward was not easy. It would not be a smooth journey. But the path was clear. He had to confront his sin head on. He had to face it and despise it, just as Padre Pio had said. He could no longer hide behind excuses or comfort himself with the idea that it was something he could control. It was time for action, and Noah knew that this battle would require every ounce of strength he had left. The next day, Noah woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He had made a decision. No more would he allow the temptation to control him. It was time to fight, and he would fight with everything he had. Every moment he spent in prayer, he would ask for the strength to resist, to stand firm, to despise the temptation that had held him captive for so long. Every thought, every desire that came to his mind, he would actively reject. He would not entertain the lies anymore. He would not justify the sin. But as he began this new chapter of his spiritual journey, he quickly realized that the fight was not going to be easy. The temptation came again, as it always did, trying to lure him back into the darkness. But Noah, this time, was different. With every passing day, he could feel the strength within him growing. It was as though a force outside of himself was empowering him to stand tall, to refuse to give in, to take back control of his life. In moments of weakness, he would return to the words of Padre Pio, remembering the call to despise the temptation, to fight it with determination. And in those moments, Noah would rise again. He would not allow himself to fall back into the same patterns. The struggle was hard, but each victory, no matter how small, built on the last. His soul cried for help, yes, but now it was crying out in victory, not defeat. Noah knew the road ahead would still be difficult. He knew there would be times when the temptation would seem insurmountable. But in that moment, with Padre Pio's words in his heart, he had taken the first step toward freedom. He would no longer be a slave to his desires. He had made the decision to fight, and with God's help, he would win this battle. The breaking point had come, and it had led to the beginning of Noah's true healing. Noah sat alone in the dimly lit room, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together in silent prayer. The weight of his past actions pressed heavily on his chest, but something had shifted within him. For the first time, he had fully acknowledged the extent of his weakness. For so long, he had tried to ignore the truth, suppressing the feelings of guilt and shame with distractions, self-deception, and the hollow comfort of denial. But now he could no longer escape the reality. The temptation that had once seemed like a manageable part of his life had become a beast that controlled him. It had stolen his peace, his joy, and his connection to God. For weeks, Noah had wrestled with the decision, but now he knew what he had to do. He had to face this struggle head-on and confront the dark corners of his soul. He needed a path to purity. He needed to break free from the chains of sin that had ensnared him for so long. But how? The first step was clear. Confession. It was time to confess the truth, not just to the priest, but to God and to himself. With a heavy heart, Noah found his way to the confessional, his mind racing with doubts and fears. What if the priest judged him? What if his sin was too great to be forgiven? But as he knelt there, preparing to confess, a sudden sense of peace washed over him. The words flowed out, hesitant at first, but soon more freely, as he poured out the depths of his struggle. Each word of confession seemed to lighten the burden he had carried for so long, but still, the fight was far from over. The priest's voice was gentle but firm as he offered guidance, reminding Noah that the true battle lay not in simply acknowledging his sin, but in actively working to overcome it. Avoiding temptation is not enough, the priest said, his words sharp in the silence of the confessional. You must replace sin with virtue, Noah. Only then will you find true freedom. Noah's heart ached at those words. Replace sin with virtue. It sounded so simple, yet so impossible. How could he take something so deeply ingrained in his nature and replace it with something pure, something holy? But the priest's counsel echoed in his mind, and he knew that there was no other way forward. He had to change, and it had to be from the inside out. With newfound determination, Noah turned to prayer and fasting. He dedicated himself to these practices with a fervor he had never known before. The prayers became his refuge, a constant source of strength in his daily battle. He would wake early each morning before the world had fully stirred and pour out his heart to God, asking for guidance, for strength, for the ability to resist temptation. The act of fasting became a symbol of his commitment to God, a reminder that he was willing to sacrifice his desires for the sake of purity and holiness. But as the days went on, Noah quickly realized that this path would not be as easy as he had hoped. The temptation still lingered, knocking at the door of his heart, trying to pull him back into the darkness. There were moments when the weight of his desires seemed too much to bear. His mind would wander, and his thoughts would turn back to those moments of weakness, those fleeting moments of indulgence that had brought him comfort, albeit temporary. How could he fight this battle alone? How could he possibly win when the enemy was so persistent? One evening, after a particularly intense moment of struggle, Noah found himself at a crossroads. He had spent the entire day praying, fasting, and seeking God's guidance, but his desires had not gone away. They still tugged at him, urging him to give in. For a moment, he considered the possibility that perhaps it was all too much, that maybe he was not strong enough to overcome this on his own. But then something shifted inside him. A voice, soft but firm, reminded him of the truth he had come to learn. Avoiding temptation wasn't enough. He had to replace the sin with something greater. He had to take control of his desires, not let them control him. His past actions were not a reflection of who he was meant to be. They were simply the result of his weakness, his failure to embrace the fullness of God's power in his life. He was not defined by his past struggles. What mattered was the present moment, and what he chose to do with it. In that moment, Noah made a decision. He would not give in. He would not let the temptation control him anymore. Instead, he would fill his life with something greater: devotion, self-discipline, and love for God. Each time the temptation arose, he would turn to prayer. Each time he felt the pull of desire, he would replace it with an act of kindness, of service, of giving. Slowly but surely, Noah began to see the changes in himself. The more he dedicated himself to God, the more he experienced the peace that only comes from living a life aligned with his will. But even then, Noah knew that the battle was far from over. The road to purity was long and winding, and he would stumble along the way. But each time he fell, he would rise again. He would not let the temptation win. He would not let sin define him. And through it all, he would remember the words of the priest and of Padre Pio, words that had now become a mantra in his heart. Temptations against purity must be fought with strong determination. Do not argue with them. Despise them. There were days when the temptation seemed overwhelming, and Noah felt like he might slip back into his old ways. But with each passing day, he learned that he was not powerless. He could fight, and he could win with God's help. He would no longer be a slave to his desires. He had chosen the path to purity, and he would continue to walk it, step by step, no matter how difficult the journey. As Noah progressed on this path, he began to realize something powerful. The strength to overcome temptation did not come from his own willpower alone. It came from God's grace. Through prayer, fasting, and devotion, he was learning to surrender his will to God's, to trust that he would provide the strength Noah needed to stand firm. There's something profound about replacing sin with virtue, isn't there? When we actively replace our weaknesses with strengths, we don't just overcome temptation, we grow in holiness. It's in that very process of struggle, surrender, and growth that we find ourselves transformed, becoming more like Christ with every passing day. As Noah continued his journey, he found peace. Not because the temptation had disappeared, but because he had learned how to manage it, how to resist it, and how to replace it with something greater. And in doing so, he had found a deeper connection with God, one that would carry him through whatever challenges lay ahead. But what about you? Have you ever struggled with temptation in a way that seemed insurmountable? What have you done to fight it? Do you feel like you're on the path to purity, or does the battle still feel too strong? Share your thoughts below. Noah's life had been a constant battle. For years, he fought in the shadows, trying to outrun the darkness that threatened to consume him. Every night, as the world slept, he would be left alone with his thoughts that grew louder, more insistent. The temptation had once felt like a whisper, an invitation to indulge in something forbidden, something that would bring relief from the pressure of his daily life. But that whisper soon turned into a roar. It became a force, a constant companion, following him everywhere he went. It was no longer just a fleeting desire, it had become a grip on his very soul. The weight of his guilt was unbearable. There were moments when he thought he might break, when he felt as though there was no hope left. Each time he tried to break free, the temptation would only grow stronger. It was as though he was caught in a cycle he couldn't escape from. His faith felt weak. His prayers felt empty. Every relationship seemed distant, as if the very sin he had been hiding was casting a shadow over every part of his life. But then something began to change. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, a sudden moment of enlightenment. No, it was slower, more subtle. Noah began to realize that his struggle wasn't a sign of his weakness, it was the evidence of his humanity. And that realization led him to something far more powerful than self-loathing: hope. Slowly, he began to see the path forward. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was there. It was God's grace. He had been struggling with the temptation alone for so long, but now he understood that he couldn't fight it by himself. The fight wasn't against the temptation. It was against the lies that told him he was powerless. The truth was, He wasn't alone. It was during this time that Noah found a renewed connection with his faith. His prayers began to change. They were no longer requests for strength to fight temptation alone. They were pleas for God's will to be done in his life, for his grace to fill the spaces that had once been filled with shame and guilt. Slowly, God began to answer those prayers, not in the way Noah expected, but in ways that were far more transformative than he could have imagined. Noah's heart began to heal. The peace he once thought unattainable slowly crept into his life. It didn't happen overnight, but the more he sought God's will, the more he found himself changed. He no longer felt burdened by the weight of his sins. The darkness that had once held him captive was being pushed back by the light of God's love and forgiveness. The feeling of peace that had eluded him for so long began to settle into his soul. It was as if Noah had come out of a fog. The shame he had carried for so long began to lift, and with it, the clarity he had been desperately searching for. He began to see the world differently. The temptations that had once seemed insurmountable now seemed like fleeting distractions, easily pushed aside by his newfound devotion. His relationship with God had grown deeper, and as a result, he felt an increasing sense of purpose. He was no longer defined by his struggle, by his past. He was defined by the grace he had received and the transformation that had taken place within him. One evening, as Noah sat reflecting on his journey, he was struck by a thought. His struggles had not been in vain. The very weakness he had once feared was now his greatest strength. He had become stronger not by denying his battle, but by embracing it. His story, his testimony, was not just for him, it was for others. The peace he had found was not meant to be kept to himself. It was meant to be shared. He had been transformed, and now it was time for him to help others find the same transformation. Noah began to open up. He no longer hid his struggles or kept his battle in the dark corners of his heart. He began to speak openly about his journey, about the temptation he had faced, and how he had finally found victory through God's grace. His testimony was raw, honest, and filled with the hope that he had found in Christ. He knew that by sharing his story, he could help others who were fighting the same battles he had fought. People started to listen. Those who had once been silent about their own struggles now felt encouraged to speak up. Noah's openness gave them the courage to confront their own darkness, to acknowledge their weaknesses, and to seek the strength they needed to overcome. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. It was about the daily choice to turn away from temptation and toward God's will, no matter how many times they stumbled. Noah's story became a beacon of hope for those who felt like they were too far gone, too broken to be redeemed. And as Noah continued to speak, he saw the power of his own transformation. What had once been a source of shame had now become a source of strength. He was no longer ashamed of his past. Instead, he saw it as the very thing that had led him to the light. The darkness he had lived in made the light all the more beautiful. It had shown him the depths of his need for God's grace, and now it propelled him to help others find that same grace. But as Noah shared his testimony, something unexpected happened. He began to understand that his struggle was not just a personal journey, it was a journey that was shared by many. Each person he spoke to had their own battles, their own temptations, their own dark secrets, and yet, each of them, like him, could find victory through the same source: God's love and grace. It was then that Noah truly understood the power of his transformation. It wasn't just about overcoming his own struggles, it was about helping others to do the same. His greatest weakness had become his greatest testimony. It was through his struggle that he had found his purpose, to help others find the same peace and victory that he had found. What had once been a source of shame had become a tool of redemption, a way to reach out to others who were lost in the same darkness. As Noah continued on his journey, he found himself more at peace than ever before. The battle was still there, but it no longer defined him. His life had been transformed, and with each day, he was reminded that the light had won. It had always been stronger than the darkness, and now, it was up to him to share that light with the world. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of transformation and overcoming temptation. Throughout this video, we've witnessed a powerful story unfold, one that many of us can relate to, whether we want to admit it or not. It's a story about the darkness that can grip the heart, the hidden battles that take place in silence, and the ultimate victory that is possible when we turn to God for strength. We started with Noah, a man who appeared righteous on the outside, yet struggled deeply with the temptation of lust. On the surface, he seemed like the perfect example of faith, but inside, he was fighting a battle that no one knew about. His temptations grew stronger, and his guilt more unbearable. He tried to manage it on his own, believing that he could control it. But as we saw, the temptation didn't just go away, it got worse. The longer he fought in isolation, the more it tore at his soul, pulling him further away from God and from the people he loved. But what happened next is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Noah, in the depths of his struggle, found hope. He found truth in the words of Padre Pio, who taught him that temptations aren't to be negotiated with or justified. They are to be fought with strong determination and rejected with the full force of our will. This moment was pivotal. It wasn't just a turning point in his life. It was the key that unlocked his path to freedom. Noah's story is not just a story of a man fighting temptation. It's a story of finding the courage to face your battles head on, to acknowledge your weakness, and to surrender it to God. As Noah began to confront his sin, his life started to change. He didn't just ask for God's help, he took action. He embraced the tools that God provided: confession, fasting, and prayer. He didn't just try to avoid temptation, he worked actively to replace his sinful desires with virtues that would strengthen his spirit. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was through his commitment to prayer and self-discipline that he began to experience a shift. The temptation that once controlled him no longer had power over him. Through God's grace and his own determination, he found peace, clarity, and a renewed relationship with God. By the end of his journey, Noah had become a living testimony of God's transformative power. His past, which once seemed like a burden too heavy to carry, became the very thing that gave him the strength to help others. What was once his greatest weakness became his greatest strength, a tool to help others find the same victory and freedom he had found. Noah's story reminds us that no matter how deep in darkness we may find ourselves, there is always a path to the light, and that path begins with humility, prayer, and the courage to face our struggles. Now, I want to ask you this. Do you relate to Noah's journey? Have you ever faced a struggle that seemed too big to overcome? Or perhaps you feel like there's a battle raging within you, one that no one knows about? The truth is, you're not alone. There are so many people out there battling similar temptations, whether it's lust, addiction, anger, or any other sin that seeks to steal our peace. But just as Noah found a way to overcome, so can you. If you feel like you need more guidance, more inspiration, and more practical advice on how to fight your own battles, I have a playlist waiting for you. It's filled with videos on overcoming temptation, embracing God's grace, and transforming your life through faith and action. These videos are designed to help you take the next step on your own journey, just like Noah did. Each video in this playlist dives deeper into the struggles many of us face and provides the tools, the encouragement, and the hope needed to rise above them. In these videos, you'll learn not only about how to overcome the biggest temptations in life, but also about how to walk confidently in the light of God's love and grace. You'll hear powerful testimonies, practical steps to fight sin, and spiritual truths that will change the way you view your struggles. So, if you're ready for that transformation, I encourage you to click on the playlist and continue this journey of growth, healing, and victory. But before you do, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of Noah's story? Can you relate to his struggle? How has this video inspired you to tackle your own battles with temptation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you and be part of your journey. We're all in this together, and your story could be the one that encourages someone else to take that first step toward freedom. Remember, the path to purity, peace, and transformation is not a journey you need to walk alone. there is always hope. There is always a way forward, and with God's grace, there is always victory. So take that next step, click on the playlist, and let's continue walking this journey together.